So hello, my name is Anastasia. Uh, I'm a developer and visual artist, so I work with Unity, and I'm working currently with Vlad on some experiences, like some experiences you saw before. We actually worked together on it. So my focus is visual design. I came to games first from illustrations, and I switched to 2D games and 3D games, and then ultimately VR. So today, my talk will be a bit more technical and a bit more practical. It will be focused on the experiences we actually built. I will talk about world building, but mostly like from a visual design perspective. So I will cover like the avatar, the environment, and like different kind of art direction ideas. So the main questions you want to answer when you start to think about your experience is you want to define like what kind of world your player will be in and what he will do. And when you start to answer these questions, it's very important to consider your medium and what makes it specific. In the case of VR, it's of course like immersive. It has to have an interactive and physical component, not only because you interact with the environment and you have a kind of gameplay interaction, but also because you have a kind of bodily presence in this world. And it's very important to think about it. And also the visual part for me, I mean, everything I will say is very subjective, like there's different ways of thinking about all these questions, but I tend to think that the visual part is very, very important because you have a very wide field of view and the environment is literally all around you. So I think, yeah, it's something which should really be important. And so once you consider these questions, then you can think about the aesthetics, how you would translate the answers to these questions you found into visuals. So I have a few things to say about it. I would tend to say that concerning the kind of feeling or the kind of ideas you want to transmit, it's pretty good to trust your guts and to go with the very core idea that you have at the start, and then to refine the design, and especially also to refine your taste. It's important to always be looking into like visual references, things which are new, but it's good to follow trends, but if you do so, like to kind of try to stay always at the edge of it. Otherwise, there is no real sense into like, I don't know, to me at least, to bring these kind of things. Like you're better off with just doing something intemporal and simple, geometric, minimalistic, whatever. So in the case here, I just gathered a few things that we focused on when we started to think about the aesthetics for the Whump experience. So we focused on some kind of body horror organic visuals. This is a artwork by Sam Rolfs that Vlad mentioned before, which is a very interesting 3D artist, which is not coming from the gaming world, but has very interesting aesthetics. And the way Kabibo, which Vlad also mentioned, is working, because he's using a lot of, like he's not a 3D modeler, so he's using a lot of calculation to create everything you see in the world. Like, it doesn't rely on 3D modeling. And we wanted to mix these different approaches. So your aesthetics always have to serve your core idea. This is very important. Like, each time you make a visual choice or each time you just make a design choice in general, you have always to consider like why you are doing it and does it really serve your purpose. Like, for example, it's pretty common to see VR games which take place into a square cube. And if you ask yourself the question a bit honestly, it often comes from the fact that as a designer, you're thinking about the tracking area you have. And so subconsciously, we'll just like design your space as being this cube. And I think all your questions have to, all your visuals have to go through this lens. And so about how we went with Whump, we had a kind of idea of the kind of, so the idea about the womb, it's a game where you start in the womb and you go through the different stages of life, and it's focused a lot on organic aesthetics. So once we defined that was our idea, that was the kind of aesthetics we wanted, then we have a kind of core art direction, and from that we can define what kind of tools we use. So In my case, for the 3D, for this project, I used Houdini, which is pretty well known to be a tool used to do like visual effects. For a long time, very few game developers use it because it's just not kind of a traditional 3D tool for game development, also because it's not focused on low poly modeling. But actually, you can perfectly do low poly modeling in Houdini, you just have to be careful about what you do. And also, like recently, Houdini started to focus much more on the game development markets, because what you can actually do is that, well, first of all, it's a node-based interface. So you build for example, you can model your asset normally with a low poly shape, and then you will build a node tree to, for example, make this kind of procedural growth around your shape. So this is like what I did, for example, like the first experimentations. So it's a very, very practical approach. Because you can very easily iterate. You can just like change one value in the tree and your asset will look totally different. Also, it's very useful when working on games because you have to adjust a lot of things when you create your assets. And here, the whole workflow is completely non-destructive. So you can always go back, and if you want to add, like, I don't know, a finger, if you want to make the shape longer, if you want to do whatever, you just change one value there. And that's it. Like, you don't have to remodel the whole thing from scratch. And for us, because we are like a team of 2 people, this is very, very useful. Because otherwise, we would need like a lot of 3D artists. I wouldn't be able to do the assets on my own. So for that, it's very useful. You can also actually, once you have this node tree, you can export your asset to Unity and choose which are the variables that you export with it. And if you use the Houdini engine for Unity, then you can instantiate like different shapes and just like when you instantiate them, like tweak some values and have like a bunch of different different shapes made from one single asset. So we decided to like push this generative approach even more. Vlad is writing a lot of generative texture for the project, so it can be like either just image texture or height maps, normal maps, whatever. Like, we are using this approach a lot. Also because it serves this first idea of making something which looks organic. So it's always about like this initial idea. So the same here, like the combination between like this procedural modeling, well, it looks a bit obscene, but that's how it is. Like procedural modeling and procedural textures. And yeah, so this is how we kind of developed the whole thing. Ray marching. So when I was talking about Kebibo before, it's a tool, a technique that this developer uses also a lot. So basically, the noise you see here in the sky, you will see it better in the video later. It's also animated. It's not a mesh. It's not a picture. It's not a flat skybox. It's actually volumes. So when you look up, like in VR, it has actually some depths, and it's all calculated, like with the magic of ray marching. So yeah, so the story of Whump now. Okay, we have the aesthetics, we have the art direction, we know which tools we want to use. How do we tell the story? Because like this whole idea of going like with this very visual, abstract game doesn't really fit like to have like a narrative, someone like telling you the story or like. And overall, also like when we were thinking about this idea of the cycle of life. How do you tell such a story without falling into something too subjective? Like, because you can think about, okay, the story of life, you're born, then you get married, you have kids, all kinds of stuff happen, but it's, after all, like, it doesn't mean much. Like, a lot of people will not relate to this kind of story. Everybody has a past which is different. So, yeah, like, we had to think about these kind of questions. And so we decided to go with a very symbolic language, and we decided to have this environment. You go through the different stages and to focus on the evolution of the body and the growth of the body. So the environment around the player is actually a representation of his stage of life. Like, it's kind of an abstract representation of being born and growing growing like as a teenager with stuff growing from all sides and then getting old and dry and yeah, so we decided to go with this idea that this idea of the archetype, that you decide to tell the story through strong symbols instead of relying on like narration kind of. So the avatar, it's very important because it's literally the link between like your experience and the player. It's the body of the player. But it's important to really think about it because, okay, yeah, it's the body of your player, it will allow your player to interact, but there is a lot of things you can actually communicate when you design the avatar of your player. Like, you can, like, it's literally, you have to think about, like, everything that you can, like, communicate through it. So I think it's useful to think about the VR avatar as a puppet, when you don't, like, a lot of experiences just have floating controllers, but in our case, like, we decided to go with arms with inverse kinematics, which means that you have a bone chain in your model, which is rigged, and depending on the position of the arm, like the bend of this bone chain is calculated. So, and it literally works like a puppet, like that you're animating. It can be like a useful way. I tend to think that it's a useful way to think about it. And then, like, yeah, like, well, so, for example, this question. So, okay, your player is here. He has to understand, like, what he is, you know, like, okay, I'm in this world, like, what the fuck I am, like. And here you can use like the visual design of your avatar, like to communicate this idea, like what kind of creature you are, and essentially also like yeah, you can actually like some things that we use, like for example, to play with the body scheme of the player is pretty interesting. Like instead of having an arm with 2 bones, like to have 10 bones, so you have an arm which is kind of like a snake, or instead of having 5 fingers, to have 6 of them, or just 3 maybe. And each one of these choices I think are pretty interesting because it's close enough to what a human is. And well, here I put this picture, but actually, for example, the alien of Giger could also be a good example. There is an interesting area like in stylization of the character where it looks human enough so you can relate, but alien enough that it feels completely strange. So, and I think it's a very interesting area like to explore, or at least like it's something that we tend to play with. Once you have the design of these arms, of this avatar, and that the player sees a bit like what kind of thing he is, then he has to understand what he can do with his body. For this, I tend to think that, well, then we'll launch the video, but I would like to talk first. You can indicate a lot, like through the animation, for example. If you have a grip animation, like what kind of animation you decide to put, it can give an indication about what you're supposed to do with these hands, for example. Yeah, so this is an idea. And also, like through the animation, we will see when it launches, the idle animation or the way it's animated, it's important to have an expressive design of your avatar, but it's also very important to have an expressive animation, which will tell about your character, but also eventually about the environment it's in. You will see that here, for example, the animation, like for example, the fingers will bend like very far behind sometimes, or they will wobble a bit. And it kind of communicates something about the liquid environment you are in. So it's a little detail, but it actually like adds a lot of expressivity into the whole thing. So now maybe we can see, you will see a bit some of the... So yeah, you can see like here the sky, these shapes which are like, it's the same asset but instantiated different times with different variables, so they look a bit different each time. So yeah, the hands and everything. Yeah, like this kind of, like then it's possible also to go through like the details of it, but yeah, I don't know if we need to watch the whole thing, but maybe it's good enough, yeah. Ah yeah, and this was a sphere that sometimes people are stuck in, like, which Brad was talking about. Here also, like for this reptiloid scenes experience, like also like about stylization and animation, we can watch quickly. There isn't that much to see, just to show off the asset a bit. isolated. Because it's this hand that will be shown, it's supposed to be used with the knuckle controllers, which are finger tracking, so you can track the 5 fingers, but you have 6 of them. So it's interesting, like for example, with one of the fingers, we decided to map it on 2 of them. So like when you bend like your small finger, it actually bends 2 of them in the animation. So it was a kind of, I'm not sure it's still like really the best way to go with it, but it was kind of an experiment about how it could go. Yeah, I think it's good. Yeah. Okay. The environment. Yeah. So I would tend to think that, like at least in this experience, but in general, it's very. I really believe in the strength of a good color scheme and a good composition. Like it's just a basic like visual arts idea, but I believe that it really can convey a lot. And to me, like really, the color scheme is really what defines the mood of your overall experience. Like it's very important to consider it wisely, and to pay a lot of attention to lighting, also because when you put like your assets and your texture and everything, like the lighting can really like change drastically, like the way it actually looks. Also the scale. So an interesting thing about VR is that there is like this idea of depth that Vlad already covered, and then there is the idea of scale, which is very, very important. And I think for this topic, it's interesting to look a bit eventually like into architecture or into set design for theater. This idea of like how did people so far like design spaces for people to be in, or like the fact that if you have a very wide space in VR, it really gains a lot of power. Like you can really convey a lot, like through like we didn't like experimented with it like that much so far, but I believe it's a very important point like to consider when you design your environment. Also, yeah, interactivity and variety. I think it's not necessary to cover it too much, and that's it. So yeah.